My parents collected rent from my apartment for 28 months, $1,450 every month. For 28 months. They told me the apartment was mostly vacant, that there had been problem tenants, that maintenance costs were eating into everything, that the numbers weren't adding up, and I shouldn't count on it for income yet. They said this while a young couple named Marcus and Kelly paid them on the first of every month without a single late payment for 2 years and 4 months. I found out on a Tuesday afternoon in November when I drove to the apartment to check on it myself for the first time since my grandmother left it to me. I knocked. A man I had never seen opened the door. He said, "Oh, are you here about the lease renewal?" I said, "I'm sorry." He said, "You're the owner, right, Nina?" I said, "Yes." He said, "Your parents said you might stop by. Come in." I walked into my own apartment. 2 chairs, a small table, someone's coffee going cold on the counter. A life fully assembled in a space I had believed was empty. Before I tell you what happened next, please take a moment to like and subscribe. Drop your city and local time in the comments. I love knowing where you are right now. Now let me take you back 3 years to a woman named Rose and a brass key with a yellow ribbon. And the moment she said, "This one's yours, sweetheart," it always was. My name is Nina. I'm 22 years old. And the most important thing I can tell you about my grandmother is that she did things with intention, not fanfare, not an announcement. She decided something, did it quietly, and told you after. Rose Calloway was born in 1941 and had spent 53 years running what she called her small empire. 4 apartment units in a 3-story building she'd bought in 1978 with money she'd saved for 11 years while working as a school secretary. She managed them herself until she was in her late 70s. Fixed minor things herself when she could. Knew every tenant by first name. Kept meticulous records in a green ledger book she filled with her neat handwriting and sharpened pencils. The building she sold in 2019 when her niece stopped cooperating with stairs. But she kept 1 unit, the ground floor apartment in the back building, which had its own entrance, its own small patio, and a kitchen window that got the afternoon light from the west. She kept it because she'd always kept it available for people in transition, she said. People who needed a soft place while they figured out what came next. She rented it for years, below market rate, always. To a young nurse during her residency, to a couple saving for a house, to a doctoral student who needed quiet. She kept the same green ledger, same pencils, same neat handwriting. When I was 19, and she was 81, she called me on a Thursday afternoon and said, "Nina, come see me this weekend." I drove to her apartment on Saturday. She made tea. We sat at her kitchen table, which was the same table she'd had since 1967, and she opened a folder. Inside was a deed of transfer. "My name is on the second line," she said. "The apartment on Decker Lane is yours now. I transferred it last month. It's been recorded." I stared at the paper. She said, "Don't make a face. It's not that complicated. The building is yours. You rent it. The income is yours. You manage it or find someone to manage it. It's a real asset, Nina, and I want you to understand what that means before I'm not here to explain it." I said, "Grandma, I'm 19. She said, "I know. That's why I'm telling you now, while you still have time to learn it right." She slid a brass key across the table, a yellow ribbon tied through the hole at the top. She said, "I put the ribbon on so you can find it in your bag. You're always losing things in your bag." I laughed, which was the right response. She held my hand for a moment. Then she said, "This is real, a real property that generates real income. Don't let anyone tell you it's too complicated for you or that you should leave it to someone else to handle. You're capable of understanding this. You just have to pay attention." I went home with the deed folder and the key in my bag, yellow ribbon visible above the zipper. The following month, I started university. 3 hours from home, a dormitory room, the specific chaos of the first year. I called Grandma every Sunday. I thought about the apartment occasionally, the way you think about things you own but haven't touched yet. My parents offered to help. I want to be clear about what they said, because the exact words mattered later. My father, Robert, called me in October of my first year. He said, "Nina, your grandmother's apartment has been sitting empty. We can manage it for you while you're at school. Handle the tenants, collect the rent, and transfer it to your account after taking a small management fee. That way, you don't have to worry about it." I said, "What percentage?" He said, 10%. "Standard for property management?" I said, "That seems fair." He said, "We'll keep records. Transfer the rest to you monthly." Looking back now, there were signs. The way he'd called me before I'd had a chance to think about managing it myself. The way the offer came quickly, specifically, as though it had been planned before the call. The way he said it, "We'll keep records so you can review them anytime." But I was 19. I had class the next morning. My father had been offering to handle things my whole life, and I had always said yes because it was easier than learning something new alone. I said yes. I said yes. And I went back to studying. Grandma Rose died the following spring. I held her hand at the end, the same hand that had slid a brass key across the table 6 months earlier. I wore the key to her funeral on a chain around my neck. My parents organized the estate. The apartment, they said, was already covered. I believed them. For 2 years and 4 months, I believed them. November of my 3rd year, a Tuesday. I was driving home for a long weekend, and I decided on impulse, the kind of decision that comes with no particular reason, just a feeling, to stop at the apartment on Decker Lane first. I hadn't been there since the transfer. I'd never been inside. I parked in the small lot behind the building. Took the brass key from my bag, yellow ribbon slightly frayed now from 3 years of contact with other things. I walked around to the back entrance. The patio had a potted plant. I registered this before I registered anything else. A small terracotta pot with a rosemary plant, slightly overgrown, the kind of plant a person tends occasionally without being precious about it. Someone was here. I knocked. And a man opened the door. Marcus was 28. He introduced himself immediately. The reflex of someone who answers the door expecting a landlord check-in and wants to make a good impression. He said, "Nina, your parents mentioned you might come by eventually. This is great timing, actually. Kelly and I have been meaning to ask about the lease renewal." I said, "The lease renewal?" He said, "Yeah, our current term ends in February. We'd love to stay. This place has been really good for us." I stood in the doorway of my apartment, which had been home to 2 people for 28 months, which had a rosemary plant on the patio and someone's coffee on the counter, and a life lived in every room. I said, "Can I come in?" He said, "Of course." The apartment was clean, warm, and smaller than I'd expected from the deed description. A living room with bookshelves. A kitchen with the west-facing window Grandma had mentioned. A hallway leading to a bedroom and a bathroom. Everything neat. Everything is cared for. Kelly came out of the bedroom when Marcus called to her. She was carrying a laptop and wearing a sweater too big for her, the comfortable kind. She looked at me with the friendly wariness of a tenant meeting an owner for the first time. She said, "We've been hoping to meet you." I said, "I've been hoping to meet you too. I want to tell you exactly what happened in the next 40 minutes, because the sequence matters." I told Marcus and Kelly, calmly, that I was doing a routine check-in and would love to look at any documentation they had. They didn't hesitate. Marcus went to a drawer in the kitchen, the kind of organized drawer that tells you something about a person, and pulled out a folder. Inside was their lease agreement. I read it standing at the kitchen counter. The lease was for 12 months, dated 2 years and 4 months ago. Tenant names, Marcus Webb and Kelly Orton. Monthly rent, $1,450, payable on the 1st of each month. Management contact, Robert and Linda Calloway. My parents' names, their phone numbers. And on the last page, in the section labeled Property Owner, my name is Nina Rose Calloway. And my parents' signatures below as Authorized Management. Below that is a clause. I read it twice. The clause stated that the management agent would collect rent and transfer the remaining balance, after the agreed 10% management fee, to the property owner's designated account within 5 business days of collection. I took a photograph of every page. Then I asked Marcus and Kelly if they had payment records. They did. Kelly brought out a different folder. 28 receipts, 1 for each month. Each one was signed by my father. She said, "We always got a receipt. Your dad was very prompt about that." I looked at the receipts. $1,450 every month. 28 times. I did the math standing at the kitchen counter with their coffee still going cold 3 feet away. 28 months at $1,450. $40,600 in total rent collected. 10% management fee, the agreed amount. $36,540 that should have been transferred to my account. I checked my phone. 3 years of bank statements. Monthly. 0 transfers. Not one. Not ever. I set the phone face down on the counter. Marcus was watching me with the expression of someone who is beginning to understand that he is accidentally in the middle of something. He said, "Is everything okay?" I said, "I'm gonna need to make a phone call." He said, "Of course. Take whatever time you need." I went to the patio, the one with the rosemary plant. I sat on the low wall at the edge of the patio, and I looked at the November sky for several minutes. I did not call my parents. I called my grandmother's attorney. Margaret Holt answered on the second ring. She remembered me. She'd handled the deed transfer 3 years ago, and she'd handled Grandma Rose's estate after she passed. She had a voice that carried the specific steadiness of someone who has spent a career in situations that require it. I explained what I'd found: the tenants, the lease, the receipts, the clause, the zero in my account. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Nina, what you're describing is a breach of fiduciary duty. Your parents acted as your management agents. That carries a legal obligation. Collecting rent and retaining it rather than transferring it per the agreement is a civil matter at minimum." I said, "What do I do?" She said, "First, I need you to get me a copy of that lease and all the payment records. Then I need to show you something." She paused. She said, "When I filed the deed transfer 3 years ago, I also drafted a property management agreement for your grandmother's records. She anticipated that you might need someone to manage the apartment while you were at school. She drafted the terms herself." She said, "Your parents never signed that agreement, Nina. They created their own lease with your name on it, but they never formalized the management arrangement with you or with this office." I said, "What does that mean?" She said, "It means they had no documented authority to act as your agents. And the money they collected belongs to you." I looked at the rosemary plant. I said, all of it," she said. She said, "There's one more thing. Your grandmother left a sealed note with the original deed transfer documents. She asked me to give it to you if a situation ever arose with the apartment that required legal involvement. She was..." Margaret paused. She was quite specific about that condition. I drove to Margaret Holt's office the following morning. She handed me a cream-colored envelope with my name on the front in Grandma Rose's handwriting. The pen was slightly shaky. She'd written it in the last year of her life when her hands were less certain than they used to be. I didn't open it in the office. I put it in my bag next to the brass key, and I listened to what Margaret had to say. She laid it out clearly. The lease Marcus and Kelly had signed was legally binding because my name was on it as the owner, meaning the tenants had done everything correctly and were fully protected. The problem was entirely with my parents' side of the arrangement. They had collected rent as unauthorized agents, retained funds that belonged to me by the terms of the lease clause, and had never disclosed any of this. $36,540 over 28 months. Margaret said, "You have several options: a formal demand letter, a civil claim for conversion, that's the legal term for when someone wrongfully takes personal property belonging to another, or a private resolution." I said, "I want to understand what happened first." "Fully," she said. "I know, but I'd encourage you to move carefully. Once your parents know you know, they'll have time to prepare their version of events. Right now, you have the element of truth on your side, and they don't know it." I nodded. She said, "When do you next see them?" I said, "Family dinner. Sunday. My aunt and uncle are in town." She said, "That's 3 days." I said, "Yes." She said, "Do you want to handle it there?" I sat with that for a moment. My Aunt Patricia was my father's older sister. She was the kind of person who had always seen my father clearly, not unkindly, but honestly. She had called him Robert the Manager since they were teenagers, meaning he managed situations to favor himself with such consistency that it had become his defining trait. If the truth came out at Sunday's table, it would come out in front of someone who knew him, someone who wouldn't be managed by his version of events. I said, "Yes, Sunday dinner." Margaret said, "Then come back Thursday. We'll prepare what you need." I drove home. Not to my parents' house. To my dormitory apartment, 3 hours away. I needed 3 days of ordinary life before Sunday. My parents called me twice in those 3 days, once on Thursday. My mother, warm, asks about my visit to Decker Lane. She said, "Your father mentioned you stopped by the apartment. Everything okay over there?" I said, "It looked fine. I'm just getting to know it better." She said, "That's good, sweetheart. Your father's really kept it together for you." I said, "I know." Thursday night, I thought about calling Marcus and Kelly, about warning them that something was happening. But they were innocent. They'd done everything right. I didn't want to frighten them before I understood the full picture myself. Once on Saturday, my father this time, he said, "Looking forward to tomorrow. Your Aunt Pat's excited to see you." I said, "I'm looking forward to it too." He said, "Everything good?" I said, "Everything's fine, Dad. Fine." That was true. I was fine. What I was building was something else. Have you ever had to sit with information that changed everything and wait and act normal and say I'm fine to the person who made the information necessary? If you have, type enough in the comments. Tell me you understand that specific kind of patience. And if you haven't subscribed yet, please do it now, because Sunday dinner is where this goes. Thursday at Margaret's office. She had prepared 3 documents. The first was a legal summary, the property management obligation, the lease clause, the amount owed, and the legal basis for the claim. The second was a printout of my bank account history. 28 months. Every month labeled, every month showing 0 transfer from the Decker Lane property. The third was a copy of the lease Marcus and Kelly had signed. My name is at the top. My parents' signatures are at the bottom. The clause that made the whole arrangement a documented broken promise. I put all 3 in a manila folder. I put the folder in my bag next to the brass key. I drove home on Saturday afternoon. That evening, my Uncle Gary called me. Not about Sunday. He was asking about something unrelated. He remembered I'd mentioned an interest in property investing and wanted to share an article. We talked for 20 minutes about markets and timing and the kind of patient long-term thinking that builds something over time. He didn't know yet that I'd inherited a property or that anything had happened. But Gary had always been practical. When he said goodbye, he said, "Come find me tomorrow after dinner. I want to hear about what's happening in your life." I said, "I'll find you." I think he heard something in my voice. That night, I read the lease clause again. I had read it 6 times in 4 days. Monthly rental income shall be collected by the management agent and transferred to the property owner's designated account within 5 business days of collection, less the agreed management fee of 10%. Within 5 business days. 28 months. My father is not a forgetful man. He is organized. He keeps receipts, Margaret had told me. He'd signed 28 of them personally. He hadn't forgotten. He decided. And every month when he decided again, the decision had been easier than the month before. That's how these things work. The first time is the hardest. By month 12, it's just a routine. By month 28, it's just how things are. That night, I also found something I hadn't expected. I was going through Grandma Rose's folder, the original deed transfer documents Margaret had given me years ago, looking for something specific. And I found, paper clipped to the back of the deed, a photocopy of the apartment's rental history. Rose had kept records going back to 2003. Every tenant, every rent amount, paid every month. In her green ledger, transferred to typed pages, organized by year. The apartment had never been vacant for more than 6 weeks between tenants. The apartment had never had a problem tenant. My parents had told me both things were happening. Neither was true. I set the rental history beside the lease on my desk and looked at them for a long time. Then I added the rental history to the folder. Then I went to sleep. Saturday night. Late. I drove to Decker Lane. I parked in the lot. The lights were on inside the apartment. Marcus and Kelly's warm yellow through the kitchen window with its western exposure, late enough that the light was the only thing visible against the November dark. I didn't knock. I sat in my car and looked at the light in the window of the apartment my grandmother had kept for 53 years for people in transition. People who needed a soft place while they figured out what came next. She had given it to me. She had believed I was ready to understand what an asset meant. And I had handed it to my parents without a second question. The tears came without warning. Not a collapse. A quiet overflow I let happen in the dark of the parking lot, with the November cold seeping in through the car vents and the rosemary plant invisible in the darkness of the patio. I cried because I had wanted this to be different. I had wanted my parents to do what they said they would do. I had wanted the 10% and the records and the monthly transfers to be real. I had wanted to be the kind of person who gives her parents a task and trusts them to do it, and is right to trust them. I wasn't that kind of person. Or rather, I had been, and it had cost me. I stopped crying. Wiped my face. Opened my bag. The brass key was in its usual place, yellow ribbon showing above the zipper. Frayed now at the edges from 3 years of contact with other things. Grandma Rose had said, "So you can always find it." I held it for a moment. Then I put it back. Then I opened the cream envelope she'd left with Margaret and read the note. 1 page. Her handwriting, slightly shaky, every word deliberate. "If you're reading this with Margaret, then something happened with the apartment that needed attention. That means you paid attention. Good. Here is what I want you to know. I gave you this property because I believed you would take it seriously. Not because you were the oldest or the smartest or the most prepared. Because when I showed you the ledger, you asked how I knew which expenses were legitimate. That question told me everything. The right person for something is always the one who asks the right question. Whatever happened, handle it. You know how. All my love, Rose." I folded the note, placed it back in the envelope, placed the envelope in the folder with the documents. If someone who loved you ever left something behind that proved, in one moment, that they knew exactly who you were, tell me about it in the comments. I want to hear it. And now let me tell you what happened at that dinner table. Sunday. 6 o'clock, my parents' house. The dining room table set for 6, Mom and Dad, my brother Alex, Aunt Patricia, Uncle Gary, and me. The smell of the house was the same as it always was, something roasted in the oven, the particular warmth of a room that's been heated all afternoon for guests. My mother had lit a candle in the center of the table, the tall kind that made the light slightly amber. Patricia hugged me in the hallway. She's not a tall woman, but she has a quality of presence, the kind that comes from 61 years of paying attention. She held me for a moment longer than a standard greeting hug. She looked at my face. She said, "Okay?" I said, "Yes. Ask me later." Her expression changed in a way that my parents, coming from the kitchen, didn't see. We sat. My father poured wine for the adults and sparkling water for Alex, who was 15 and thought sparkling water was sophisticated. My mother served the roast. It was the kind of dinner that happens when family visits, more effort than the usual, the good plates, the candle. Conversation moved through the usual channels. Alex's school, Gary's work, Patricia's volunteer project at a library 3 towns over, and my mother's mention of a trip they were thinking about. My father asked about my coursework. I answered. He said, "Sounds like things are going well," I said. "They are." Then Gary said, "Nina, I was thinking about what you mentioned last month, about building something stable. I know you have the apartment your grandmother left you. How's that going?" He asked it casually. He genuinely didn't know. But he asked it at the table in front of Patricia, Alex, and both my parents. I looked at my father. He was looking at his plate. He had done it smoothly, given no signal that the question was dangerous. He was good at that. I reached into my bag. The folder was there. The brass key was there. I took the folder. I placed it on the table. My mother looked at it. My father looked at it. The candle made the amber light slightly warmer, slightly more intimate, in the way of lighting that was meant for something nicer than what was about to happen. I said, "I went to the apartment on Tuesday." My father said, "We know." "Your mother mentioned you called." I said, "I met Marcus and Kelly." The table went very still. Patricia looked at my father. Something moved through her expression that she didn't perform, just a quick recognition of something she had seen before in his face. I said, "They've been living in the apartment for 28 months. My mother set her fork down. I opened the folder, placed the lease on the table, turned so my father could read it. I said, "This is their lease. My name is on it as the owner. Your names are on it as management." He said, "Nina, this isn't..." I placed the payment records beside the lease. 28 receipts. I said, "These are the payment records Marcus and Kelly provided. $1,450 every month. Your signature on each one." I placed the bank statement printout beside that. I said, "This is 28 months of my account. No transfers, not one." I placed the legal summary Margaret had prepared. I said, "This is a summary of the obligation created by the lease clause. $36,540 after the agreed management fee should have been transferred to my account." My father said, "We were going to discuss this. I was going to sit you down this year and explain the situation. There were expenses." Patricia said, "Robert, one word." My father stopped. She said, "I want you to hear what you're about to say before you say it." The candle flickered. Someone's fork was still resting on the edge of a plate at the wrong angle. Alex was looking between my father and me with the uncertain expression of someone who is 15 and is understanding for the first time that adults are not as organized as they appear. My father looked at the documents on the table. He looked at his sister. He looked at me. And for a long moment, longer than it should have taken, he said nothing at all. The consequences fell like dominoes. Each one made a sound. My father said, finally, that there had been repairs, that the income had been used to cover costs he hadn't disclosed to me, that he'd intended to settle it properly when he had the numbers organized. Patricia said, "Robert, you've been saying that since you were 12, I'll settle it when I have the numbers organized. What does that mean?" My mother said, "Linda, please." Patricia said, "I'm not talking to you, Linda. I'm talking to my brother, who just got caught with $36,000 he never told his daughter he had." The number, said aloud, was different from seeing it on paper. Alex made a small sound. He was 15 and $36,000 was an abstract number until it was said in a dining room with a candle burning and a folder of evidence on the table. I said, "I'm not asking for an explanation tonight." Everyone looked at me. I said, "I'm telling you what I found. The documentation is with Margaret Holt. She's already been contacted. What happens next is a conversation I want to have separately with you two, with Margaret present." My father said, "You went to an attorney." I said, "She's been Grandma's attorney for 20 years. She's mine now." He said, "Nina, this is a family matter." I said, "Dad, it's It's a legal matter that involves family. He didn't have an answer. My mother was crying quietly. Not performed. The soft kind that comes when someone understands the full shape of something for the first time. She said, "We were going to fix it. We kept saying we'd fix it." I said, "I know." I believed her on that part. I believed they had said it to each other. I believed they had fully intended to fix it before I needed to know. That belief, sincere and consistent, is how things like this run for 28 months without resolution. They didn't plan to steal from me. They planned to repay what they were borrowing and stop borrowing it. But planning and doing are different things. And the months had passed, and they were still planning. And $36,000 had become the floor of a room we all lived in that I hadn't known was there. Patricia stayed after dinner while my parents and Gary went to the kitchen. She sat across from me at the table with the documents still arranged between us. She said, "Your grandmother knew this could happen." I said, "I know." She left a note. She said, "Did she tell you what to do?" I said, "She said, handle it." Patricia was quiet for a moment. She said, "When you were 11, your grandmother and I had a conversation about you. She said that one asks the right questions. She meant it as the highest possible compliment." I said, "I didn't ask the right questions for 3 years." She said, "You were 19, and you trusted your parents. That's not a character flaw. That's normal." She looked at the folder. She said, "The right question now is what outcome you're trying to reach." I said, "I want what belongs to me, and I want it to mean something. Not just as money, as a lesson in what managing property actually requires." She nodded. She said, "I'll talk to Robert." I said, "Don't defend him to me." She said, "I'm not going to. I'm going to tell him what this actually looks like from the outside." She was the right person to say it. I went to Decker Lane the following morning. I knocked. Marcus answered. He'd been expecting me. I'd texted him the night before to say I'd stop by. We sat at their kitchen table. Kelly brought coffee. The west-facing window had the morning light instead of the afternoon, which made the kitchen look different from how I'd imagined it. More silver. Sharper. I told them simply that there had been a situation with the management of the property that was being addressed, that their lease was valid, that their tenancy was secure, that nothing was changing for them. Marcus said, "Are you okay?" I said, "I'm getting there." Kelly said, "We loved your grandmother, you know. Your parents told us about her when we moved in. They showed us a photo. She sounded like someone." I said, "She was." Kelly said, "We have a plant on the patio. Rosemary." I always hoped she'd have liked it. I looked at the patio through the kitchen window. I said, "She would have loved it." My parents made full restitution over 6 months. Not voluntarily, exactly. Margaret was involved. There were formal letters. There was a structured repayment agreement. But they did it. $36,540 transferred in installments to my account with documentation at each step. Margaret added a new property management agreement to the file. Formal, signed by all parties. Terms clear. My father signed it at a table in Margaret's office in February. He looked older than he had at the Sunday dinner. Not ill, just smaller somehow. Like a thing that has been examined from the outside and doesn't quite recover its original shape. He said, as he signed, "I kept telling myself we'd fix it before you noticed." I said, "I know." He said, "That's not a good thing." I said, "No. But saying it out loud is a start." He looked up. I said, "I'm not done being your daughter. But I need you to be honest with me going forward. Not managed. Honest." He said, "I understand." He meant it that day. Whether it holds is a different sentence and a longer one, and I'm still in the middle of it. My mother called me every 2 weeks through the spring. The calls were short at first, then longer, then occasionally comfortable in the way that comes when two people decide to be honest about something that was previously unsaid. She said once, "I think I was afraid that if we told you about the money, you'd stop needing us." I said, "I never stopped needing you." She was quiet. I said, "I just needed different things than what you were offering." That was true. The most honest version of it, anyway. In the spring, I opened Grandma Rose's green ledger. Margaret had included it in the estate documents, and I'd put it in a box and not opened it for 2 years. I sat at my desk with it on a Sunday afternoon. Every page was in her neat handwriting. Every tenant, every payment, every expense, every note. The kind of record that says, "I was here, I was paying attention, this mattered enough to document." On the last written page in the margin, she'd written 2 words in pencil. Faint. Easy to miss. For Nina. She'd been writing it for me. She'd been building the ledger as something I would eventually inherit too. I sat with that for a long time. It's June now. Early summer. Marcus and Kelly renewed their lease in February. 1 year, same terms, a small increase that Margaret helped me set at a fair market rate. They're good tenants. The rosemary plant survived the winter and is growing sideways in the way rosemary does when it's comfortable. I've been to the apartment 6 times since November. Each time I walk around the patio, check the exterior, knock on the door, and sit with Marcus and Kelly for a few minutes. Each time, I understand a little more about what my grandmother meant when she said you have to pay attention. Not obsessively, not anxiously, just consistently. The way she filled the green ledger, page by page, one precise entry at a time. I've been thinking about what I learned this year, not about my parents, not about the money, about myself. I learned that trust without verification isn't trust. It's hope. And hope is a beautiful thing in the right place, but it is not a management strategy for a legal asset. My grandmother knew this. She built it into her question, how do I know which expenses are legitimate? She was teaching me to ask, to require an answer, to make accountability a normal part of how I engaged with things that belonged to me. I didn't do that. I handed the property to my parents and walked away for 2.5 years and told myself I was trusting them when I was actually just not looking. They made a choice I wouldn't have made. And I made a choice that gave them room to make it. Both things are true. I've been careful, in the months since, not to turn what happened into a story that's only about what they did. Because that version is easy. And easy versions of complicated things don't teach you anything you can actually use. The harder version is this. The people we trust most have the most room to disappoint us. That's not a reason to stop trusting. It's a reason to make trust specific. To ask the question my grandmother would have asked. To keep a ledger, not because you suspect the worst, but because you respect the thing enough to document it. The brass key is on my desk now. I moved it from my bag to the desk when I started visiting the apartment regularly. The yellow ribbon is frayed almost through. I should replace it. But I haven't, because I know what it is and where it is. That's enough, my grandmother said. So you can always find it. I found it. So I didn't win against my parents. There's no winning when the people who take from you are the people who were supposed to protect what you'd been given. You just document and act and repair what can be repaired and understand that what you inherited wasn't only a property. It was a way of paying attention. I'm still learning it, page by page, one entry at a time. If someone in your family ever handled something that belonged to you and handled it wrong, I want to hear about it. And if you've ever had to go back and pay attention to something you should have been watching all along, type Ledger in the comments. I want to know I'm not alone in that process. Subscribe and hit the bell. A new story every day. Check the description for more stories like this one. I'll see you tomorrow.